The photograph was taken in 1892, somewhere in rural Kentucky. 6 women stand in a line, all wearing white dresses, all holding the same bouquet of dried lavender. They share the same dark eyes, the same tight mouth, the same look of something you can't quite name. At first glance, you'd think they were sisters at a family reunion. But look closer. Look at the date written on the back. These women were born 20 years apart. They were not sisters. They were mother, daughters, granddaughters, and every single one of them married the same man. Not a man with the same name. The same man. Their father. This is the story of the Harrow family, a bloodline that should never have existed, a tradition so disturbing that when it finally ended, it didn't end with justice. It ended with a girl running barefoot through the woods at midnight, dragging a suitcase she'd packed in secret, praying she'd make it to the train station before her father woke up. Her name was Iris Harrow, and she was the first woman in 4 generations to refuse. But before we go any further, let me say this. What you're about to hear is real. It's documented, and it's been buried for over a century, not because people didn't know, but because no one wanted to believe it. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is not folklore. This is not exaggeration. This is the kind of story that makes you wonder how many other families like the Harrows existed in America's forgotten corners, where isolation became a kind of law and bloodlines became prisons. The kind of story that reminds you, just because something happened a long time ago doesn't mean it didn't happen at all. The Harrow family lived in the hills of eastern Kentucky, in a place so remote it didn't even have a name on most maps. They owned land, they had money, and they had a secret that everyone in 3 counties whispered about but no one dared to say out loud. Because in places like that, in times like those, silence was survival, and the Harrows made sure everyone stayed silent. His name was Ephraim Harrow, and he was born in 1843, just 2 years before the end of the Civil War. He inherited 400 acres of timberland from his father, along with a stone house built into the side of a hill, and a reputation for being what people back then called peculiar. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew, reading from a Bible he'd annotated himself in tiny, cramped handwriting. The preacher never questioned him. No one did. Ephraim married for the first time when he was 21 years old. Her name was Adelaide, and she was 16. They had a daughter in 1865. They named her Constance. Adelaide died 3 years later, during the birth of a second child who did not survive. The town mourned her briefly. Ephraim did not remarry. Not right away. But when Constance turned 14, something shifted. People in town began to notice that Ephraim no longer introduced her as his daughter. He introduced her as Miss Harrow. He bought her dresses meant for a woman twice her age. He had her hair done in town, styled like a bride's. And when she turned 15, in the summer of 1880, there was a ceremony. It was small, private, held at the Harrow estate with no guests, no preacher, and no record filed at the county courthouse. But everyone knew. A ceremony had taken place, and after that, Constance Harrow was no longer called his daughter, she was called his wife. She bore him 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 son. The son died in infancy, the daughters survived. Their names were Evangeline, Dorothea, and Iris. They grew up in that stone house on the hill, raised by their mother who was also their sister, taught by their father who was also their grandfather. They were homeschooled, they were isolated, and they were told, from the time they could understand language, that this was how it had always been, that the Harrow bloodline was sacred, that God had chosen them to remain pure. When Constance turned 32, she became ill. Some say it was consumption, others say it was something darker, something that happens to a body when the mind has been broken for too long. She died in the winter of 1897, thin as a skeleton, refusing to speak. Ephraim buried her in the family plot without a headstone, and within 6 months, there was another ceremony. This time, it was Evangeline, his eldest daughter. She was 16 years old. Evangeline Harrow had her mother's dark eyes and her father's silence. She had watched what happened to Constance. She had seen the way her mother moved through the house like a ghost, the way she flinched when Ephraim entered a room, the way she stared out the window for hours, as if she were waiting for someone to come save her. No one ever did. And now it was Evangeline's turn. The ceremony took place in the spring of 1898. There were no witnesses, no cake, no music. Just Ephraim, Evangeline, and a man named Reverend Thaddeus Colt, who had been paid a significant sum to travel from 2 counties over and ask no questions. He performed the ritual in the parlor of the Harrow house, his hands shaking the entire time. Afterward, he left and never spoke of it again. When he died in 1912, his diary was found among his belongings. In it, he had written only one sentence about that day: "I have done something God will not forgive." Evangeline bore Ephraim 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The son lived this time. His name was Ezra, and he was raised to believe that what his father had done was not a sin but a tradition, a legacy, something sacred that had to be protected. Ezra would grow up to continue what his father started. But we'll get to him later. Dorothea was next. She was 14 when Evangeline became her father's wife, and she understood what was coming. Some say she tried to run. That one night, in the summer of 1902, she packed a bag and made it as far as the road before Ephraim found her. He dragged her back by her hair, locked her in the cellar for 3 days with no food, no light, no sound except the rats. When she came out, she never tried again. Her ceremony happened when she turned 15. By then, Ephraim was 59 years old. His hair had gone white. His hands trembled when he poured his tea, but his grip on that family had not weakened. If anything, it had tightened, because now it wasn't just him enforcing the tradition. It was Evangeline too. She had become what abused daughters sometimes become, an enforcer, a believer. She told Dorothea it was an honor, that resistance was a sin, that their bloodline had been chosen by God to remain unbroken. Dorothea had 2 children, both daughters. Their names were Iris and Clementine. And it was Iris, years later, who would finally break the chain. But not yet, not for a long time. Because first, she had to grow up in that house. She had to watch her mother disappear into herself, just like Constance had. She had to sit at the dinner table while Ephraim read scripture about obedience and purity, his voice low and steady, his eyes on her the entire time. She had to feel the weight of what was coming, every single day, like a noose tightening slowly around her throat. Ezra Harrow was born in 1901, and from the moment he could walk, he was told he was different, special, chosen. He was the first son to survive in 2 generations, and Ephraim treated him like a prophet. He was given his own room, his own books, his own horse. While his sisters were taught to cook and sew and keep silent, Ezra was taught to read Latin, to manage the estate, to understand that the blood running through his veins was not like other people's blood. It was purer, holier, and it was his responsibility to keep it that way. Ephraim began grooming him early, not just to inherit the land, but to inherit the tradition. He told Ezra that the outside world was corrupt, that marriage to outsiders diluted the bloodline, that what they were doing was not sin but preservation. He showed him the family Bible, where generations of Harrows had been recorded in meticulous handwriting, each entry noting who had married whom and how the line had remained unbroken. Ephraim called it the Book of Purity. Ezra called it Gospel. When Ephraim died in 1923, at the age of 80, he died in his sleep with Dorothea beside him. She was 37 years old and had not left the property in over 2 decades. She would outlive him by only 4 years, dying of what the town doctor called melancholia, though no autopsy was ever performed. Some say she took her own life. Others say her body simply gave out. Either way, she was buried without ceremony in the family plot, next to the woman who had been both her mother and her sister. Ezra inherited everything, the land, the house, and his 2 half-sisters, Iris and Clementine, who were also his nieces. Iris was 12 years old, Clementine was 9, and Ezra, now 22, understood exactly what his father had expected him to do. But Ezra was smarter than Ephraim. He knew the world had changed. It was the 1920s now. There were telephones, there were automobiles, there were laws, even in the hills of Kentucky, and people were starting to ask questions about families like his. So Ezra adapted. He became charming. He donated to the church. He hired workers from town to help with the timber business, and he paid them well enough that they didn't pry. He smiled. He waved. He made people believe the Harrows were just another family trying to get by, but inside that house, nothing had changed. Iris grew up watching Ezra the way a rabbit watches a hawk. She saw the way he looked at her when she turned 13, then 14. She heard him talking late at night with Evangeline, who was still alive then, still enforcing the tradition, still convinced it was God's will. Iris began having nightmares. She would wake up screaming, and no one would come. She started writing in a journal, hiding it beneath a loose floorboard in her room. In it, she wrote the same sentence over and over again. I will not be next. I will not be next. I will not be next. She was 15 when Ezra told her it was time. It was supposed to happen on a Saturday in October of 1929. Ezra had planned everything. He'd invited Reverend Colt's replacement, a man named Pastor Grimm, who asked even fewer questions for twice the price. He'd bought Iris a white dress, the same kind Constance and Evangeline and Dorothea had worn. He'd set the date. He'd prepared the parlor. And he'd told Iris, in that calm and steady voice he'd learned from his father, that resistance would only make things harder for her, that this was her purpose, her destiny, that every woman in the Harrow family had walked this path. And she would too. Iris said nothing. She nodded. She ate her dinner. She went to her room, and Ezra believed she had accepted it, the way the others eventually had. But Iris had been planning too. For 2 years, she had been stealing, small amounts, a few dollars from Ezra's desk drawer, coins from the kitchen jar, bills from his coat pocket when he came home drunk, which was happening more and more often now that Ephraim was gone. She'd been hiding the money in her journal, between the pages, smoothing the bills flat so they wouldn't crinkle. She had $43. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She also had a plan. There was a train that came through the town of Harlan, about 11 miles south, every Sunday morning at 5:30. If she could make it to that train, she could go north, maybe Louisville, maybe further. Somewhere Ezra couldn't follow. Somewhere the name Harrow meant nothing. On Friday night, the night before the ceremony, Iris packed a single suitcase. One dress, one pair of shoes, her journal, the money, a photograph of her mother, Dorothea, taken before everything, when her eyes still had light in them. She didn't pack anything else. She didn't want to carry the weight. She waited until 2 in the morning. The house was silent. Ezra was asleep in Ephraim's old room. Evangeline, now 47 and sick with something the doctors couldn't name, was asleep down the hall. Clementine, Iris's younger sister, was in the room next to hers. Iris thought about waking her, thought about bringing her along. But Clementine was only 12, and Iris knew she wouldn't make it. Not 11 miles through the woods in the dark, not without slowing them both down. So Iris made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She left her sister behind. She climbed out the window, barefoot because shoes made noise. She carried the suitcase in one hand and ran, through the yard, past the family graves, into the woods. She ran so hard her lungs burned. She ran until her feet bled. She didn't look back. Somewhere behind her, a dog began to bark, then another. Then she heard a door slam, and she knew Ezra had woken up. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Ezra Harrow had inherited more than land and tradition from his father. He had inherited the belief that he owned everything inside the boundaries of that property. The trees, the stones, the women. And when he realized Iris was gone, he did not panic. He did not call the police. He simply did what men like him had always done. He went hunting. He saddled his horse. He took his rifle. And he rode into the woods with 2 hunting dogs and a lantern, moving through the darkness like something that had done this before. Maybe he had. Maybe other daughters had tried to run, in other generations, and no one ever wrote it down. Maybe the woods around the Harrow estate were full of secrets no one would ever find. Iris heard the dogs before she saw the light. She was maybe 4 miles from the house, her feet torn and bleeding, her lungs screaming. When she heard them baying in the distance, she knew what it meant. She dropped the suitcase. It was slowing her down. She kept only the money, shoved into the pocket of her nightgown, and the photograph of her mother, tucked against her chest. Then she ran faster. The forest was thick and black and full of shadows that moved. Branches tore at her arms. Roots tried to trip her. At one point, she fell into a creek, the water so cold it knocked the breath out of her. She thought about staying there, letting the cold take her. It would be easier than what Ezra would do if he caught her. But something in her refused to stop. Some part of her still believed she could make it. She climbed out of the creek and kept running. Behind her, the dogs were getting closer. She could hear Ezra now, shouting her name. Not angry, calm, like he was calling her in for dinner. "Iris," he called. "Come home, Iris. You're going to hurt yourself." His voice echoed through the trees, soft and terrible, and it made her skin crawl. She didn't answer. She just ran. At some point, she lost track of time. She didn't know if she'd been running for 1 hour or 5. Her body was moving on instinct now, her mind somewhere far away. She thought about her mother. She thought about Constance. She thought about all the women who had stayed, who had given up, who had let themselves be swallowed by that house. And she made herself a promise. Even if she died out here, even if Ezra found her body in the woods, she would die free. And then, just as the sky was beginning to turn gray with dawn, she saw it. A road. A real road, not a dirt path. And in the distance, the faint outline of buildings. The town of Harlan. She stumbled out of the woods and onto the road, her nightgown soaked with creek water and blood, her hair wild, her eyes wide and animal. A farmer driving a cart stopped when he saw her. He asked if she was all right. She didn't answer. She just pointed south and whispered, "Train station." He didn't ask questions. Maybe he saw something in her face. Maybe he'd heard rumors about the Harrows. Either way, he let her climb into the cart, and he drove her into town. By the time Ezra reached the edge of the woods, Iris was gone. The dogs lost her scent at the road. He stood there in the early morning light, holding his rifle, staring at the town in the distance. And for the first time in his life, Ezra Harrow realized something. He had lost. Iris Harrow boarded the train to Louisville at 5:32 that morning, October 19th, 1929. She paid for her ticket with the crumpled bills she'd been saving for 2 years, and she sat in the back of the car with her arms wrapped around herself, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't look out the window. She just stared at the floor and counted her breaths until the train started moving. And when it did, when she felt that lurch forward, that slow pull away from everything she'd ever known, she closed her eyes and cried so quietly no one noticed. She never went back. Iris arrived in Louisville with no contacts, no family, and $41 to her name. She took a room at a boarding house on the east side of the city, paid a week in advance, and locked the door. For 3 days, she didn't leave. She just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photograph of her mother, wondering if Clementine was still alive, wondering if Ezra had punished her for what Iris had done. She would never know the answer. Iris eventually found work at a textile factory. She changed her name to Iris Brennan, a name she invented on the spot when the foreman asked. She told people she was from Ohio. She told people her family was dead. And in a way, they were. She never spoke about the Harrows again, not to anyone, for the rest of her life. But she wrote about them. In her journal, late at night, she wrote everything. The ceremonies, the bloodline, the women who stayed, and the girl who ran. She wrote it like a confession, like a warning, like evidence. When Iris died in 1983, at the age of 69, that journal was found among her belongings by a social worker cleaning out her apartment. The social worker read 3 pages and immediately contacted the Kentucky State Police. An investigation was opened, records were pulled, and what they found confirmed everything Iris had written. Ephraim Harrow had married his daughter Constance in 1880. Constance's daughter Evangeline had married Ephraim in 1898. Evangeline's sister Dorothea had married him in 1903. All of it documented, all of it witnessed, all of it ignored. But here's the part that haunts me most. The investigation also found records of Clementine, Iris's younger sister, the one she'd left behind. Clementine Harrow had married Ezra in 1932 when she was 15 years old. She bore him 2 daughters. She never left the property. And when she died in 1961, At the age of 41, the cause of death was listed as complications from childbirth, though she hadn't been pregnant. No autopsy was performed. No questions were asked. Ezra lived until 1974. He died at 73 years old, wealthy, respected, surrounded by people who called him a pillar of the community. He's buried in the Harrow family plot, next to Ephraim. There's a headstone with his name on it. It says, "Beloved Father and faithful servant of God." The house still stands. The land was sold off piece by piece after Ezra's death, and the stone house on the hill sat empty for decades. It's private property now, owned by someone who doesn't live there. The windows are boarded up. The graves are overgrown. And if you ask people in town about the Harrows, most of them will tell you they've never heard the name. But some remember, the old ones. They'll tell you to stay away from that place. They'll tell you it's cursed, and maybe it is. Not by ghosts or demons, but by something worse. By silence. By the choice people made, over and over again, to look the other way. Iris Harrow broke a cycle that had lasted 4 generations. She ran barefoot through the woods at midnight and made it out alive. But the cost of that survival was everything. Her sister, her name, her past. She spent 54 years looking over her shoulder, waiting for Ezra to find her. He never did. But in a way, he didn't have to. Because she never stopped running. Her journal is kept now in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society. It's not on public display. You have to request it. And when you do, they'll ask you why. Because some stories, they'll tell you, aren't meant to be easy to find. Some stories are meant to stay buried. But Iris didn't write it to be buried. She wrote it so someone, someday, would know what happened. So the women who stayed wouldn't be forgotten. So the girl who ran wouldn't have run for nothing. This is that story. And now you know it too.